Welcome, everyone. We will just wait a few moments while people are all being logged in. So just give us one more minute and we'll get started. All right, welcome to everyone in the audience, wherever you are. We are really fortunate to have a great panel, policy panel lined up for today, this evening, whichever it is. And it's titled Above and Below the Waterline, Combating Illegal Take and Trade of Marine and Terrestrial Species Through a New Global Agreement on Wildlife Crime. I'm Professor Tanya Wyatt of Northumbria University, and I'll be moderating this session. We have four panelists joining us, and after that, they'll speak about five-ish or so minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions and discussion. For the questions and discussion, if you could please use the bottom right control panel and put in your question, you can type it in there, or you can raise your hand and we'll try to get to your question that way as well. So our panelists are, first we'll start with John Scanlon, who served as Secretary General of CITES from 2010 to 2018. He was African Park's first special envoy from 2018 to 2020, and is now CEO of the Elephant Protection Initiative Foundation, chair of the Global Initiative to End Wildlife Crime, and chair of the UK government's Illegal Wildlife Trade Challenge Fund. He'll be followed by Daniel Keitelries, who joined Sea Shepherd Legal as Senior Policy Specialist in April of 2020. Daniel previously served in several roles at the interface between science, policy, and law, including the first Marine Species Officer of the Secretariat of the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora from 2015 to 2020. Daniel will be followed by Li Shu Li, who is a program manager at the Wildlife Conservation Society in China for their counter wildlife trafficking program. She's also regional counter wildlife trafficking coordinator for Temperate Asia, which includes Afghanistan, China, Mongolia, and Russia. And we'll conclude with Jorge Cayo, who is founder and current president of the Sociedad Peruana de Derecho Ambiental. He works as the director of the Drocosa Group and its subsidiaries, Sociedad Agricola Drocosa and Drocosa Peru, among others. So thank you very much again, and John, over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Tanya, and thanks to all of our wonderful panelists and to everyone who's joined us online today. And we're also particularly grateful to the organisers for giving us this opportunity to explore the benefits of a possible new, and we would say groundbreaking international legal agreement on wildlife crime. Now, it's just past 11 p.m. here, so it's been a bit of a long day. So apologies if I look a little bleary-eyed, and I think the same goes for some of my colleagues online. Just a few quick words on who I'm representing today. The Global Initiative to End Wildlife Crime was launched on the 5th of June last year, and it's an informal alliance of a diverse range of organisations and individuals coming from across every region and sector who support its two objectives. These objectives are interrelated, but they're interdependent. And we're encouraging states to do two things. Firstly is to institutionalise a One Health approach to wildlife trade and markets. There's many ways one can do that, but this particular issue got a good push along today with the World Health Assembly deciding to negotiate a new agreement on preventing, preparing for, and responding to pandemics. Our second objective is to promote creating a new international legal agreement on preventing and combating wildlife crime, and that's what today's event is focused on. I might just say as an aside, you may know that there is a negotiating process ongoing at the moment for the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. This is being led by the Convention on Biological Diversity. It will be adopted in May next year in Kunming. we are also advocating for that framework to include a target on combating and preventing wildlife trafficking. Now, why do we say that we need a new international agreement on wildlife crime? Historically, many have seen tackling wildlife crime as being about protecting endangered species, and in particular, the most charismatic ones. And this is obviously very important, but the critical need to end wildlife crime extends beyond a concern for the survival of a limited number of endangered species. We shouldn't have to wait for a species to become endangered and included under an international agreement before we paid any attention. An emergency ward approach to wildlife conservation is no longer good enough. We know that these crimes are not only driving many species towards extinction, but they're also degrading entire ecosystems and their ability to sequester carbon. They're depriving governments of revenue, exacerbating corruption, insecurity, and poverty. And we also know that they can pose a threat to human and animal health. Now, according to the UN IPBES, over 1 million species will go extinct over the coming decades if we do not change course. And one of the major threats to nature is overexploitation, including through wildlife poaching and trafficking. Now, we don't yet have a full agreement on the origins of COVID-19, but it most likely had its origins in wildlife, which is the same for previous pandemics. And the UN IPBES, it tells us that 1.7 million undiscovered viruses are thought to exist in wild animals, about half of which could spill over to people, including through illegal trade, markets, and consumption. And the efficacy of nature-based solutions, which got a lot of traction at the recent Glasgow Conference of the Parties, is seriously undermined by the illegal trade in fish, timber, and other wildlife, which degrades ecosystems and their ability to sequester carbon. Now, there are many UN reports, most particularly by the UN Office of Drugs and Crime, that graphically describe the industrial scale and organized nature of illicit wildlife trafficking. According to the UNODC, these are crimes that exacerbate corruption, insecurity, and poverty, and they affect every continent. And other sources put the value of illegal trade in CITES-listed species at about $20 billion annually. But CITES just covers 38,000 of the world's 8 million species. And if we consider all species, including fish and timber species that are being trafficked, then the World Bank puts this figure closer to $200 billion a year. And if we add the cost of the impacts on ecosystems, then it's estimated at a staggering $1 to $2 trillion a year. And in response to an increasing level of concern over the legal and unregulated trade in wild animals that could pose a risk to human health, we're seeing more local restrictions being placed on wildlife trade, markets, and consumption that could pose such a risk, and these restrictions need to be enforced. Now, these are challenging, global, interconnected issues, and a scaled up, collective, cooperative effort is needed to address them. Yet, notwithstanding the destructive and high-risk nature of these crimes to both people and planet, there is no global agreement on wildlife crime, as there is, for example, on human trafficking. Now, CITES has been heavily relied upon to date, but this convention was not designed to deal with wildlife crime. It's a 50-year-old trade-related convention, not a crime-related convention. And I worked for the convention for 8 years. And in the absence of any alternative, we made best possible use of CITES, and we did well. But we've stretched the CITES mandate to its limits, and we now need to do much more. We need to address all species that are being trafficked, not just the limited number of species protected under CITES, and to embed both combating and preventing wildlife crime where it belongs, namely into the international criminal law framework. Now, in response to requests from several states, last year we released details on the possible form and content of a new agreement on wildlife crime. Now, this draft has no formal status. It's simply a first working draft, but it was put together to facilitate this discussion. And to help set the scene for subsequent speakers, I'll briefly outline the content of this draft protocol. Firstly, on form, the proposal is to create a new protocol under the UN Convention Against Transnational Organised Crime. And if adopted, it would be the fourth such protocol to the convention. But it would be the first time that a crime that has a significant impact on the environment is addressed through a protocol. Now, secondly, on content. Now, this draft protocol has been drafted drawing upon the three existing protocols, as well as national legislation from across many countries across every region, as well as the UNODC guide on drafting legislation to combat wildlife crime. And this draft protocol proposes several critical things, and if adopted, it would set out the conduct that is to be criminalized. It would apply to any species of wild fauna or flora, including fish and timber, that is protected under any international or, importantly, any national law. And it would address the harvesting, taking, possessing, import or export or introduction from the sea of illicitly traded wildlife. It would make it a criminal offence to import any wildlife or wildlife product into a country if it had been acquired in contravention of the national laws of the source country. And this would represent a remarkable expression of comity between nations or a mutual respect for one another's laws. And the draft protocol doesn't just seek to combat these crimes. It also sets out obligations on collective efforts to prevent illicit wildlife trafficking, including on raising public awareness, demand reduction, sharing information, such as on known groups active in illicit trafficking, on their concealment methods and known transport routes, as well as on sharing forensics. And it also addresses the role and responsibilities of the carriers of contraband, the verification of documents and training and technical assistance. And finally, it would automatically trigger all of the tools available under the UN Convention Against Transnational Organised Crime and fall under the review mechanism recently adopted for the convention and its protocols. Now said, this is a working draft. It's here to advance this conversation, and it doesn't address everything. For example, someone's raised with me that it could and should also include provisions on protecting whistleblowers. But what this draft does do is start to show us what is possible through a protocol under this convention. Now, colleagues, enhanced global connectivity, the ability of organised crime to operate across international borders, and the trafficking of wildlife at an industrial scale requires both enhanced global cooperation and national responses to tackling wildlife crime. And if we get it right, it's the local communities living amongst wildlife and the governments of source countries, as well as our global biodiversity, climate, health and security, that will all be the beneficiaries. Now, finally, I'm delighted to inform you that in May of this year, the presidents of Gabon and of Costa Rica, two very biodiverse rich countries, jointly called for a new global agreement on wildlife crime. And this was announced at the 30th session of the Crime Commission. And in September of this year, the president of Angola joined their call. And I'd like to finish my presentation today by sharing with you a short video that captures why they have called for a new international agreement on wildlife trafficking. Nicole, it'd be great if you could play that for us. You seem to have the sound muted.
Great, thank you for that. Thank you, John, for starting us off and setting the scene. We'll move on now to Daniel.
Thank you, Tanya. Perfect. You can see the screen. So, as John mentioned, the proposed protocol also covers fish. So I will talk a bit about the IUU fishing application of this, and I'm glad to be able to share Sea Shepherd Legal's thoughts on this with all of you. So IUU fishing is a threat, and estimates of its value go into tens of billions of US dollars. There's no great definition of IUU fishing, but when looking at FAO's definition, it only includes activities that run in some way counter to international obligations that a state has entered into. So all of these activities take place outside established legal and management frameworks and make it harder to achieve effective management. At the very least, this is due to missing data, but IUU fishing also includes vessels using fishing methods banned for their outsized environmental impact or targeting protected species or violating temporal or spatial closures. Now, having established that all IUU fishing is undesirable, it's important to highlight that by definition, not all IUU fishing is illegal. And if a specific activity is illegal, will usually depend on the applicable national law. Focusing on the illegal side, the actors behind illegal fishing are often professional and well organized, operating across multiple jurisdictions and thus requiring international cooperation to counter. The proposed fourth protocol to UNTOC presents an opportunity for parties to extend the applicability of UNTOC to a broader range of IUU fishing activities and thus close some gaps in current frameworks and add teeth. Going forward, I would like to point out some key elements of the draft specifically that make it applicable to IUU fishing. First of all, in the use of terms, fish are often a forgotten component of wildlife, and in some countries they're not even included in the definition of wildlife. It is therefore noteworthy that the footnote in Article 3 of the draft protocol explicitly includes fish, as John has mentioned many times in his introduction of the protocol. The second important drafting choice is that Article 3 includes introduction from the sea in the definition of trafficking. So introduction from the sea is a CITES concept. It's one of the 4 transactions defined as trade under CITES, and it refers to the transportation of specimens from the high seas into the territory of a state. It was operationalized by CITES parties in 2013 as follows. The normal situation is on the top, where a vessel from Flag State A catches specimens in its own exclusive economic zone and lands those specimens in the port of another state. And this would be a CITES export. But the middle scenario and the bottom scenario, the vessel of Flag State A obtains the specimens on the high seas and then either lands them in its own port or in another country's port. And in both of these scenarios, although they're handled slightly differently in terms of which CITES documentation is required, they fall under introduction from the sea. Given that all fish, in order to be commercialized, have to be landed somewhere, this effectively expands the scope of the protocol to all fishing activities that take place in the high seas. Now, with such a broad scope, let's talk about how the protocol can support other mandates. One potential stumbling block for making most use of mutually supportive mandates is often to what extent these are transcribed into national law. For example, the CITES legal acquisition findings require a specimen to be obtained not in contravention of national laws. But some international instruments have a very poor track record of being transcribed into national law and would therefore not be taken into account. The draft protocol's direct reference to international laws in Article 5 represents a significant evolution in that regard that has the potential to address non-compliance with many relevant international instruments that lack their own compliance mechanisms or are not transcribed into national law. Also, subparagraph B of Article 5 gives port and transit states an additional legal basis to take action against vessels involved in IUU fishing or transport of specimens derived from IUU fishing, shifting part of the enforcement burden away from source countries and to transit and destination countries. Before concluding, I also wanted to highlight a few issues that may be useful to consider going forward. As some of you may know, Article 73.3 of UNCLOS places restrictions on the use of corporal punishment by the coastal state for IUU fishing violations in its own exclusive economic zone. And under very specific circumstances, those that would have to be taken into account when implementing the draft protocol. But there's probably a drafting solution to that, or there certainly is. The protocol also forgoes UNCLOS's requirement that the crime must be punishable by a maximum of at least 4 years in prison to be considered serious. And we think this makes sense given that fisheries crime and other environmental crime often attract relatively low penalties, but parties may wish to include other criteria for prioritization instead of the amount of prison years, for example, based on environmental damage. We also would like to note that work on wildlife crime often has a terrestrial focus and audience, and this has been referred to earlier in one of the first sessions as sea blindness. But for the draft protocol to be able to improve coordination of IUU fishing, it's really important that the fisheries sector needs to know that this negotiation or this process is going on and that it is of relevance to them, and they need to be involved and feel some ownership of the process. Lastly, we note that the role of civil society in addressing illegal wildlife trade has evolved significantly from purely awareness raising, as reflected in UNTOC, to include a variety of support to state-led law enforcement. And the draft protocol takes a step in the direction of modernizing this in Article 7.3, where it requests policies, programs, and other measures to include cooperation with civil society as appropriate. But we believe it could go further to move the needle from multinational approaches to multi-stakeholder approaches. Thank you for your attention and looking forward to your questions.
Wonderful. Thank you for covering the often forgotten fish. We'll move on now to Li Shu.
Thank you, Tanya. It is a pleasure to be in this section on wildlife crime. I work for Wildlife Conservation Society, WCS, which is a science-based conservation nonprofit group. In recent years, WCS in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, our field programs have increasingly implemented interventions to counter wildlife trafficking. As the transnational illegal trade of wildlife are one of the major threats to many endangered species that we are protecting and to the ecosystem they supported. In our CWT work from source, transit, and to the consumption countries, we found that it is very important for countries to enable sufficient and diverse legislations and mechanism resources for combating the wildlife crime. Despite the increasing international awareness raised in our sectors, and rather than a conservation issue, we now recognize wildlife trafficking is a serious, organized, and transnational crime. However, the overall enforcement priority of combating this crime along the supply chain in different countries are not high enough. On top of that, I want to highlight that there are two very unique challenges in wildlife crime. And that is why we especially need to make sure law enforcement strategy in all countries along the trade chain are diversified and resourceful. The first challenge is that it is very difficult to detect the crime happening in wildlife trafficking because the direct victims of wildlife trafficking are animal or plants, and they or their families or their neighborhoods are silenced and not able to report to the details of the crime. And for example, it is very common to see that parrots are poached and traded in the form of eggs. It could be all the way in transportation in these egg farms until the transit or end market countries. And when the trader hatch them as chicks, then the birds can make some noises. So this kind of situation is very common in wildlife trafficking crime. So it is require people or human being to firstly to able to aware this is a crime and then to report it. But however, in a lot of situations in terms of wildlife trafficking, actually people are not will not directly suffer the loss or damage from it. And that made the reporting wildlife trafficking crime even not the very relevant to people. The other challenges is the very high very high complexities of the nature of this wildlife trade. There are a lot of species that have been involved and many countries involved in the wildlife trafficking, and therefore it creates a very steep technical challenges for legislator, policymaker, or even enforcement officer to understand it. In a lot of trainings and activities, we cooperate with frontline law enforcement agencies. Officers often raise the first question is, what's the definition of species? And let alone if we're talking about like over 6,000 species involved in the trade and quite significant amounts involving different countries which are not familiar with the officer themselves. And there are also many other areas are still remain unknown for this crime, including the criminals' MOs, profiles, or even the consumers' consumption scenario, and the trade dynamic in various species and countries. And all that said has given the challenges that we need a lot of more resources to combat this crime. Next slide, please. We have seen some progress in Asia to have more inclusive and resourceful legal structure to make sure more species have been involved and criminalize more different sections of this along the trade chain. For example, in this year, in March, affected, the 11th revision of China's penal code has included wildlife for terrestrial species consumption for food purpose as an illegal offense, and also include illegally introduced invasive species as an offense as well. We also updated the list of protected animals after 32 years in this February, and that increased over 200 species into the protected list. We also see expanded counter wildlife trafficking mandate to law enforcement agencies and other regulatory agencies through legislation. One example is in August this year, China-Hong Kong Organized and Serious Crime Audience, OSCO, includes wildlife crime offenses as well. And that's allowed not only the Wildlife Management Authority, but also other law enforcement agencies working on organized crime are able to work on wildlife crime as well. Next slide, please. I think the one before. Yes. We also need have increased in cooperation among countries along the trafficking chain. That include enforcement actions, cooperation. We see some successful cooperation in Asia. In these cases, for example, in 2019, there are successful cases, joint operation among Singapore, Vietnam, and China. And those cases are all based on work on multiple international cooperation mechanism and legal instrument. So it's not only you rely on one mechanism or one treaty or one agreement. Therefore, if there are more tools available, that will allow more flexible enforcement strategy in place at different levels. And we also call for the cooperation to increase the risk and cost for the trafficker, because wildlife trafficking is mostly driven by economic motivations. Therefore, we need to increase the efforts not only in some country or at some section of the supply chain. It needs to be a whole chain solutions to put enough pressure to lower the profits of this business. Next slide, please. And in all, as some of the previous speakers already mentioned, Now, as the world emerged from the global COVID crisis, now is the time to leverage the awareness and the commitment more on the counter wildlife trafficking efforts. We think legal and policy reforms and establishment are a very powerful form of declarations of government commitments. Having different countries and governments involved in this process, it's a kind of raising awareness and raising the profile of the commitment. And we will also need to expand the commitment to support innovative, diverse, and resourceful enforcement and the crime prevention interventions. And we hope that this can be enhanced and strengthened through global policy mechanism and multilateral forum, such as UNTOC. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Li Shu. Very, very interesting. And we'll move on to Jorge now.
You're muted, Jorge.
Sorry, I was saying that I work in Peru and in South America, and through this institution, Peruvian Society for Environmental Law, in the past 35 years, we have been focusing in all the environmental issues that has emerged in the world. No, next one, please. So today, next one, I will share with you what's going on in our country and in the Amazon region. No, the next one. We have an incredible, huge economy, informal economy, illegal economy, not only in Peru, but in Brazil, Colombia, Bolivia, Venezuela. And the Amazon region, as you have seen and known by different news, is really being attacked by different types of organized crime. And we have not been focusing on wildlife trafficking only in the past years, but this is why we are very concerned that all these different type of illegal mining, deforestation, drug trafficking. Remember, we have a lot of drug groups and trafficking from cocaine in this region, and it adds to the illegal wildlife trafficking. And the numbers, the millions of dollars involved are huge. So to fight from the government, from the state, or from the judiciary, and from the authorities is really a huge task. Next one, please. We have been, this is only a picture of these 224 species confiscated in the past 6 months in different countries analyzed. These are based on data from the news, because we don't have a registration in all these countries, and we don't share this information too much. So there is no, we don't have an idea of the volume of wildlife confiscation and wildlife trafficking, in terms of number of species and number of organisms, in general. Next one, please. So enforcement and control of illegal wildlife trafficking in Peru is now one of our important concerns as an NGO, as we are. We have a very good relation with the government and with the media and with other NGOs. And we have been trying to work with the judiciary to let them know that not only the word CITES, when you go in the commerce, not only the application of that international law is important, but it's important to apply a more broad approach using not only national laws, but trying to understand that everything is linked and connected. The answer of all these judges is yes, but we need an international protocol that emphasize or international law that can really help us all work together, because we are clearly aware that this is organized crime, and this is huge effort a huge task to resolve. So what is going on today? Almost all judicial processes conclude with early termination, meaning by early termination, the agreement that the person that is that has the, digamos, acusado, how do you say that, John? The person that is with in commercing or trading, works with the prosecutor, the prosecutor, and agrees in some amount to recognizing the crime and just get free of all damages. And the evaluation of the damages are not following a methodology. So we're pushing for a new methodology, to really have a common criteria and how to establish these damages. So thank you. So next one, please. This person accused has this facility to really not being accused as guilty as we need to do it, because he or she is maybe only a little element on all this international trade chain. So now we are working in this national plan in Peru, and we know that in different countries of the Amazon region are also doing their work. We are trying to focus on the actions of the government on and all these challenges associated, the new challenges, because as I was saying, with the pandemic, the amount of illegal trafficking has increased a lot. There is a law that we are discussing in the Congress now to approve what we need, and we are talking about today, wildlife trafficking as an organized crime. That will help a lot also. Next one, please. So this is why we support the protocol. Next one. We really need that we trust that the implementation of the protocol will really help us enforcement and the judicial clarity and cooperation in countries with weak level of institutionality, as we have in Peru and Bolivia and all these countries. So what we are using as a very important conceptual tool is the One Health approach. I think the One Health approach is very important now, because everybody will understand the connection between this crime with all the other crimes and with all the problems we are facing by the pandemic. Next one, please. And what we feel is that we need a lot of capacity building, not only with the judiciary as we are doing, but with all the different authorities to reduce illegal wildlife trafficking. We are thinking that not only the workshops, but the work with person to person with the congressman, Peruvian politicians will help us a lot in the coming months to really finalize the design and approval of a national law that will specifically address the problem of this illegal wildlife trafficking. Next one, please. These are another initiatives that we're sharing now because we are aware that we need all these system in all the points of traffic, airports, inspectors, to really use a common language, a common way of identifying when an operation is illegal or not. No, we include also illegal fishing in our concerns because we have a huge coast, all the South Pacific Ocean, and we are seeing every day a lot of trafficking, illegal trafficking, and we are aware that in this case we have a lot of work to do. So finally, next one, please. I think that this fourth protocol, NANTOC, can really help us to not only be more aware, but to be more effective in this huge problem we are addressing in the world. Thank you.
Excellent. I'm sure the audience will agree with me that that was very interesting and raises some great issues, and wonderful to see the often forgotten species and parts of this regions of the world that are often left out on this panel. So thank you for putting it together. So we have one question already, and I think it's a great one. So thank you for asking this, Aziz. How can we stop the criminals from communicating and selling wildlife on social media? Is it possible to develop global laws that can ban criminals from using social media platforms? Anybody?
I think you put your hand up for that one, Tanya, so we'll pass to you.
Oh, I'm not sure about that. I think there's some good progress with the, is it called the, there is a coalition of tech companies, isn't there, that's working in this space to try to get this, but right now it's all very voluntary, and I think that's the trouble we run into with these. Yeah, Li Shu, please.
Yeah, because you just mentioned about the coalition, and one part of the activity of that coalition happened in China as well, and a lot of tech companies have joined that coalition. But we see that a lot of challenges in the online platform it's so dynamic, and because the challenge I mentioned in my presentation about species. So we get a lot of requests from partners from tech company, their security management staff, not sure if that species should be regulated or not. So some of this legal status of species and what kind of action need to be taken needs some technical solution as well. So I hope that we can have more resources to support the involvement of private sector, but also like jointly with experts on certain species, taxonomy or the legal perspective to help them. And also because the online trade are developing very fast, so there might be new challenges happening all the time. So it should be have this kind of community to combat e-commerce wildlife trafficking, not only in one country but like across country. I think providing the platforms and channels to discussion are very important to make sure we are on top of the dynamic ahead of the traffickers.
Yes, thank you, John. Yes.
There is a coalition. There's a coalition to end wildlife trafficking online. It has very good pickup. It was initiated by the non-government sector. It's had very good pickup amongst the social media platforms. I think what we find with wildlife trafficking is that the traffickers use legitimate forms of communication, legitimate forms of transport, etc., to shift their contraband one way or another. So with some social media platforms, they're in the public domain. So actually, those who want to interrogate the social media platform can also find out what illicit activity is being promoted online. It gets a bit more difficult when other platforms, whether it's WhatsApp, Telegram, or other encrypted platforms are used that are not in the public domain. That's much harder to interrogate. But I think the question was, could you have global laws that ban criminals from using social media? I don't know how you would actually do that. I think what there is quite an initiative underway to have social media platforms monitor their own social media platforms to ensure that you haven't got illicit activity, in this case with illicit wildlife trafficking, so it's not being used as a platform to do that. Certainly under the protocol that's been put forward, the language there in terms of what conduct should be criminalized goes so far as referring to organizing, directing, aiding, abetting, facilitating, etc., the illicit trafficking of wildlife. But that would be a matter of targeting that person for what they're doing online rather than having some way of banning them. It's more criminalizing the behavior that they're involved in.
Yeah, thank you. Jorge or Daniel, did you want to comment about social media in this context?
Yes, just a comment. I know that a lot of prosecutors are using internet to follow different type of crimes, not only human illegal no trafficking or whatever. How can we call that? But yeah. And some others are now in the agenda, and there is a lot of capacity building of prosecutors and their teams to try to follow and track this type of illicit actions or conducts. So I think we will need to really explore and enhance this type of vigilance or surveillance to really cope with reality. No, so it was a good question, and we need to address this also. No, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Anything, Daniel?
Well, thanks, Tanya. The first thing that I thought of coming more from the fishery side is that there's been quite some advancements in automatic detection of species using artificial intelligence in pictures. And I was wondering if that is something that could be deployed sort of in social media as well, but I'm not aware of any examples. So it's actually more of a question or a comment rather than an answer.
Yeah, I actually just finished a piece of research with Ranktos, a NGO in Brazil, and they have been creating fake Facebook and WhatsApp accounts during the pandemic and taking screenshots of all of the advertisements. And they've collected 4 million advertisements in just a few months. And this is what they're struggling with is, so if anyone in the audience is a IT whiz that can help them somehow digitize this, because our little article that's coming out, we just did 500 advertisements by hand and in an Excel spreadsheet to try to get some trends. So there does need to be a huge computer calculating part of this so that this sort of data can provide more information to law enforcement. I'm being told that there is a Zoom user out there with their hand up. I'm not seeing it, but if someone would like to ask any questions, you're very welcome to. Anyone? I don't see any more questions in the chat. Well, I would have a question for the panel. I'm wondering how wildlife enforcement networks fit into this protocol, and how you would deal with sort of the cross jurisdictional aspects to this. Are WENs the way to go for that sort of collaboration? I'm partly thinking because I've heard that the Sud WEN, Jorge, has been sort of relaunched not that long ago.
Yeah, I mean, the wildlife enforcement networks have been around for a while. I think with mixed success. I think we all know that we need cross-border cooperation to tackle transnational organized crime. And there was a recent report that came out of UNODC that looked at issues to do with mutual legal assistance from recollection, and there were no examples of it being used with respect to wildlife crime. I think what we're finding, and certainly my discussions with those involved in enforcement, are not seeing they're involved in a wide suite of transnational crimes, don't see the same level of cooperation with respect to wildlife crime that they see in relation to other serious transnational crimes. So the WENs are a soft instrument, a way of trying to bring these communities of interest together. Some of those that I've met with, you tend to get a lot of CITES officers there. With transnational organized crime, we also need to get, the customs, we need to get the police officers, we need to get the judicial system involved. Jorge has been talking about his work with judges. So I think the WENs are a part of it, but there's a lot more to it than the WENs.
Would you want to say something, Jorge?
Yes, maybe one of the key words here is normally in international law is harmonization, no? Because there are a lot of authorities that participate in the process. And if you don't have a common idea, as CITES somehow provides, no? Criteria, a specific list. In this case, we don't need a list because we are opening, no? We are saying that CITES is not enough. But harmonization is something that we need to work. This is why, in this case, the role of international law is very important to provide for a common language, a common criteria. And the other thing is, everybody knows that CITES is one of the traditional instruments that have legal instruments that has teeth, that can really be effective in the field, in the markets, in the boundaries, or in the frontiers and las fronteras, as we say in Spanish. And this is because it's very clear, no? So somehow, coming back, the word of harmonization is clear, and we have to harmonize. Maybe in the Amazon region, we should have a regional approach, and not only in the global, no? In every ecosystem, somehow have a common language, as I was saying, no?
Yeah, thank you. We have another question from Ozzy in the question and answers. You mentioned detection of wildlife crime at this time can be difficult. Do you think the use of advanced technologies such as drones can help with the detection of wildlife crime? For example, drones, ground or underwater robots that can follow or track wildlife and report any criminals that go near the wildlife. Anyone?
Yeah, I certainly think the use of modern technology can be extremely helpful in combating wildlife trafficking, both at the poaching end right through to the destination end, so from source through to destination. At African parks, which manages protected areas across many African states, the use of technology in terms of managing a protected area, knowing where the animals are, knowing where your ranges are in real time, knowing whether incidents are occurring. That technology was extremely valuable. We're seeing new technologies emerge if we go from the source towards transit and destination that can detect contraband through screening luggage. And I know of some other technology that is being developed that allows you to detect bushmeat when it's going through a scanner. So just not look to the traditional, firearms or explosives or weapons, but be able to use scanning technology to detect wildlife contraband, including bushmeat, which has public health implications as well when it's being illicitly trafficked across international borders. But I saw when I was working at CITES a huge amount of technology emerging. I know, Daniel, I'm sure you could talk about the technology you use to detect where fishing vessels are and to scan at a global scale, at scale, what's going on in the field, and to be able to identify species that are in trade as well. So technology is going to be a game changer. The drones I didn't see to be hugely successful. They weren't as effective as some of the other technologies that allowed you to track through, collars and use of technology to know where your animals and your ranges and your vehicles are in real time.
And I also want to raise that the biotechnology applied in the forensic side, it's also very useful for combating this crime. But on the other side, we also need to build on some solid base because people will use this technique. I think we need the technique to tailor for people's needs to combat the crime as well.
Yeah, great points. Thank you, Lishu. Yeah, Daniel, can you fill us in on what's happening in the marine area for technology?
Thanks for the prompt, John, and thanks, Danny. Well, on the marine side, most larger vessels have to be fitted with an AIS system, which is traditionally a collision avoidance system, but there is a very successful civil society organization, Global Fishing Watch, which has developed a very broad reach of public-private partnerships with different countries where they are tracking the entire fleet based on the AIS signals. And that information may not always be available on a vessel-by-vessel case publicly in the public watcher, but there's, as I said, some sort of more tailored services that they provide to the countries they enter agreements with. So that's a sort of a very global or high-level perspective, and that's really using a system that is traditionally thought for or intended for collision avoidance. There's also for larger vessels still there's vessel monitoring systems that are a bit more technologically advanced that specifically serve the purpose of monitoring vessel movements, and many fleets require that. And I think then those can be spoofed. There are ways to trick some of those systems. But there's also more direct observation methods. So, for example, there's of course high definition optical images that can be used to track vessel movement, but cloud cover can play a problem there. Luckily, there's more and more radar, SAR, synthetic aperture radar satellites available that really also penetrate cloud cover and give a decent chance of detecting vessels even at night and under clouds. And I think then sort of moving from that sort of satellite-based image analysis, of course, there's always the use of planes as platforms for different sensors. So again, you can put a SAR on a plane, and then on the smallest scale, exactly as Ozzy alluded to, there's the possibility of using drones, for example, to extend the range and the maritime domain awareness of individual ships. So a ship that is conducting a patrol, for example, can employ drones both to see a wider radius, but also to collect evidence from up close. So definitely in the maritime realm, all of these play a role. But then again, the sea is very large, and there's not a lot of vessels out there. So that doesn't mean we have a good understanding of what's going on, and it definitely needs more vessels at sea to sometimes be able to collect evidence and see what's going on.
Thank you for that. It's really interesting. So we have 3 questions that have come in, and I think we have just enough time to get through all of them. Our lovely colleague, hello Sheldon, who's in the audience there, he's asking, many intergovernmental organizations working on wildlife crimes, such as Interpol, UNODC, IQIC, have programs that are funded by donors and not as part of core funding. Donor funding is often directed towards certain issues in certain geographies. Do you see a path to developing consistent and predictable funding for these very pertinent programs? Anyone want to comment on funding issues?
Happy to have a go at that, and greetings, Sheldon. Thanks for the good question. I think one of the great successes of the last decade has been IQIC, the International Consortium on Combating Wildlife Crime, which brought together the Society Secretariat, Interpol, World Customs, UN Office of Drugs and Crime, and the World Bank. And I think that, was designed to try and have a more coordinated effort at tackling this transnational organized crime. When we started it off back in 2010, it was just a letter that 5 organizations signed. We didn't actually have any money for it. By the time I'd finished my time with CITES, we'd attracted $20 million for the efforts of IQIC. So it showed, we went from sort of very little to a reasonable amount of funding, certainly not enough. But we also saw all of these organizations combating wildlife trafficking into their own programs, including the World Bank setting up the Global Wildlife Program. But it's still, as you say, donor funding, which is more project-based. It's not part of the core budget, even including in UNODC, which now has a good program running. I think it's a matter of how seriously these issues are viewed by member states and by donors. And if member states of organizations like UN Office of Drugs and Crime see this as core business and a serious crime that warrants attention and core budget, it'll start to flow. While it's seen as an emerging issue or an issue that doesn't rank as highly or as importantly as other issues, it's a bit harder. So I think if we can get a protocol up and running and negotiations and a protocol up and running and ultimately in force, you've actually embedded into the international framework this issue. It has to become part of the core business. And I think you'll start to see a shift in funding. But we've seen an evolution here from little attention to it embedded in programs, money flowing. Now we need to take the next step, really embedded into the core business of these organizations. Protocol will help us do that, and then I think the funding will flow.
Great. Anyone else want to say something about funding? If not, we'll move on to the next question. Right. So thanks for the next question. Thank you for the interesting discussion. You mentioned the importance of finding a cooperative solution among countries worldwide. How would you suggest cooperating with countries that suffer from corrupt governments and make sure that these countries also imply or implement binding laws on the issue of wildlife crime? Yeah, great question that we always need to talk about in terms of corruption and what might go wrong here. Anyone? Jorge, I'll just pick on you.
Yeah, yes. And if we see the next question, is very interesting because it's linked. My quick answers. First, we have to evaluate and use the forces of citizens. Citizens' vigilance and citizens' awareness is very important because they really can, and they are always fighting corrupt governments. But as Ian says in the next question, these rangers and guards are really the heroes, no? And they normally spend their lives in that type of work, even though it doesn't matter what type of government there is, they are in the field. So we know that are very important, and we are willing, as I see it in the last resolution of UN called Tackling Illicit Trafficking in Wildlife of July of this year. They are considered in the type of calls and concerns that all member states should have to protect their lives also, no? But going back to and finishing, I think citizen participation is very important for all what we are trying to achieve. In the past 3 weeks, we had a case in Peru that the Andean fox was sold in a market in Lima, the capital of the country. And it was sold as a dog. But when it was in the house of the buyer, he realized it was not a dog. So he went to the authorities, and all the country suddenly realized that Andean fox has been taken out of its ecosystem and taken to the city, and a big discussion of this, and the picture is in my presentation. The animal became famous, and it helped us a lot for all these awareness what we need to build, no?
Yeah, great, thank you. Would anyone else want to comment on either this element of corruption, or as Jorge was saying, Ian's question around how can we raise the status of protecting nature for the rangers and wardens that are taking on this really important but dangerous work?
Yeah, just briefly on corruption. I mean, it enables the illicit trafficking in wildlife. It's a scourge that affects every country in one way or another, and that's why we have a UN Convention against corruption. CITES at 2 COPs ago adopted a resolution on corruption. It's an extremely difficult one to deal with, as Jorge said. Citizen engagement, community engagement, shining a light on it. I think sometimes, and I certainly saw this at my time with CITES, is when you raise the profile of some of these issues, they became, they got some public spotlight, they got some political attention. It was one way of, if you like, exposing some corruption, because you couldn't explain certain trafficking that was going on. So raising the awareness of these issues amongst the community, but also politically, and getting more enforcement engaged is all important, but it's an extraordinarily hard one to tackle. Hi to Ian. He's absolutely right. As Jorge said, those that are serving in the front lines are the ones who are the unsung heroes. And thankfully, they were recognised in the last UN General Assembly resolution on tackling illicit trafficking of wildlife, which is great to see, because that hadn't been the case previously. And this protocol is open. So we've done a draft just to stimulate discussion. The content of it is up to states and those who lobby states as to what the content should be. I should say the International Rangers Federation is one of the international champions of this initiative, which is fabulous. And I've spoken to Chris Gallers and others, because what we want to do is to connect the efforts at international level right down to the field. And how do these instruments support those that are in the front line? And in part, a big part of this protocol is to put pressure on the destination end. So in terms of trafficking, it's to say that, it's not okay to steal any wild animal or plant from a source country, whether protected under international law or not. If it's protected under national law, you cannot steal it. And if you get it out of the source country, you're not free, you're not home free, because if you're caught in the destination country, it's a criminal offense under the laws of the destination country to have stolen it in the first place. Now, I've seen a lot of customs authorities that if it's not CITES listed, or if they're not sure, they ignore it because they say, well, it's not protected under CITES, so it's not matter. No, it does matter. You can't steal other people's stuff. You cannot steal another country's wildlife and simply say, well, it's only protected under their national law, not under international law, so I'm okay. No, it's not okay. So that if we can do that, and there are provisions in here about demand reduction and campaigns on demand reduction, et cetera, raising awareness. If you can do that at the destination end to really put pressure on the traffickers, address demand, it does take pressure off the field. It will take pressure off the rangers because if you can stop the demand side or put a lot more pressure on the demand side and deal with the traffickers, there'll be less issues to deal with in the field. So it'll help in that way as well.
Great.
Yeah, thank you. So we have just 2 minutes left, I think. So do Daniel or Lishu, would you like to come in on either of these last questions around corruption or the rangers?
I just want to echo what John and Kohei just said, to remove the pressure from the rangers and from the poaching, from the commercial trade. But just want to also raise that some of the trafficker as a kind of bottleneck of the network are not necessarily only located in the end markets, but also could be in some transit country. And some of them are purely just doing investment on this crime and not doing the operation. Now the crime has been very, very professional. So I think the more knowledge we also need to find out to understand the crime in a more deep knowledge. And that area, I think, still remain open and need resources to support and expand. Just want to add that.
No, excellent point. Yes, Daniel.
Also echoing Jorge's and John's points, and I think that with what we talked about with Introduction from the Sea, I feel a similar sentiment applies, that it's the high seas, so that there is not necessarily a source country, but because of the Introduction from the Sea, the fourth protocol would still apply to some of those transactions. And again, so the burden that has to fall on the destination country, or in the marine context, the port country. And I think that is something where definitely a lot more attention could be focused in making sure that at ports, we know what wildlife products are going in, and making sure that also the port authorities, which may not often, or which may currently not always receive the types of training that, for example, CITES officers receive, that they are also aware, and that they also can play their part and sort of help them facilitate that they can also play their part.
Great. Just a final thank you to everyone, to the wonderful panel, great audience. Thank you for the questions. And yes, thanks again. And at least good night from those of us in Europe.
Thanks, Tanya. Thanks, Daniel, Lishu, Jorge.
Bye-bye.
Good to see you.